Colonel Mason Briggs stood in the middle of Wellington Barracks, his posture rigid, his expression stern. He looked around the parade ground, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of disbelief and disdain. The air was cool, sharp from the London rain that had fallen overnight, and everything around him seemed too polished, too quiet, too perfect. "Do you really think all this pageantry means something?" he asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. He was speaking to Sergeant Thomas Reid, who stood nearby, calmly observing the scene. Sergeant Reid didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the colonel with a steady gaze, his face showing no emotion. He didn't argue back. He didn't raise his voice. It was a silent defiance, a subtle assertion that he would not be drawn into a battle of words. The colonel was a man of action, a man who had seen combat in some of the world's most dangerous war zones, but Reid knew something the colonel didn't yet understand. Tradition mattered, not for the sake of performance, but because of what it stood for. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. The morning had arrived, and Wellington Barracks was bathed in the crisp, clean air after the rain. Puddles reflected patches of the sky, the stone walls gleamed as if freshly polished, and the military routine was already in full swing. The sound of boots on stone echoed through the ancient halls as soldiers moved in formation, voices reverberating off the weathered walls. But today was different. There was a palpable tension in the air. It wasn't something you could put into words, but it was there, something that spread through the ranks of soldiers like a silent signal. The tension was centered around one man, Colonel Mason Briggs. Briggs wasn't just any officer. He was a seasoned combat veteran. A decorated American officer who had seen action in Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other hotspots around the world. His chest was adorned with ribbons that told stories of his experiences on the battlefield. He had the kind of military resume that made other soldiers straighten up when he entered a room. But Briggs had a distinct attitude that separated him from others. He had no patience for what he considered unnecessary traditions and displays of pomp. As he walked through the gates of the barracks, flanked by two aides, he muttered under his breath, half joking but not entirely. "This is where the real soldiers hide when it rains?" he asked, looking around at the pristine surroundings. He clearly wasn't impressed, and he let it be known. That's when he met Sergeant Thomas Reid. Reid wasn't just any sergeant either. He was a man who embodied the essence of military discipline, a man who had inherited his sense of duty from generations of soldiers before him. His grandfather had fought at Normandy, his father had served in the Falklands, and Reid himself had seen enough combat to know that true strength wasn't about loud displays but about quiet resolve. Reid was tall, his uniform impeccable, the ceremonial blues fitting him perfectly. There was something striking about him, something that went beyond the outward appearance. It was his calm, his unshakable stillness. It wasn't forced or fake, it was a calm born from years of knowing exactly who he was and what he stood for. This was a man who had seen enough action to understand that the loudest voice in the room wasn't always the most powerful. "Sergeant, this is where you guys do your little dog and pony show, huh?" Briggs scoffed, eyeing Reid's uniform. "Hope she appreciates all the ironing. Looks like half your arm is made of starch." Reid didn't react. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He simply kept walking, his hands behind his back, his posture as straight as the rifle he carried. He was a man of few words, but the few words he spoke held more weight than any argument. "This is where we guard the Queen's legacy, sir," Reid said, his voice level and professional. His tone was not condescending, but there was an unmistakable edge to it, a quiet strength that made it clear he wasn't intimidated. Briggs laughed, but it was a hollow laugh, a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He was testing Reid, trying to provoke him, to see if he could get under the soldier's skin. But Reid didn't bite. He didn't rise to the bait, as Briggs continued his critique of the traditions and discipline around him. He began to push harder. He started questioning Reid directly, asking if he had ever carried a real weapon, or if the bayonet he carried was just for tourists. It was a jibe meant to provoke, to challenge Reid's credentials as a soldier. Reid's eyes flickered toward Briggs for just a moment, acknowledging the challenge but not responding to it. That small, subtle movement, a flick of the eyes, was enough to unsettle Briggs. It was a quiet admission of strength, of resolve. And that, more than any words, was what truly got under Briggs' skin. As Colonel Briggs continued to test Reid's patience, the two moved into the officers' gallery, a place where history seemed to hang in the air. The gallery was dark, with heavy wood paneling, oil paintings of soldiers in battle, and brass plaques that caught the light from tall windows. It was a place that made you feel the weight of centuries, a place where every corner seemed to whisper of the past. Briggs walked through the gallery like a man who had already seen enough. He wasn't impressed. Stopping in front of one of the paintings, a dramatic depiction of a soldier charging into battle, he muttered, "So this is what glory looks like in frame form." Nice brush strokes. Briggs turned to Reid, clearly expecting some response. "Ever been in anything like that, Sergeant?" Reid paused for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I served 2 tours in Helmand," he said quietly. "Matter of fact, my section lost 3 men in a single afternoon." Briggs glanced at Reid, half expecting some crack in the soldier's armor, some sign of emotion or weakness. But Reid's face remained unchanged, his gaze steady. "And now you hold rifles like props," Briggs continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Bit of a come down, isn't it?" Reid didn't flinch. He didn't get defensive. He simply looked at Briggs, his eyes calm but resolute. "We serve where we're ordered, sir," he said. "No job is beneath a soldier." Briggs was taken aback, clearly unsettled by Reid's response. He expected Reid to argue, to defend himself, but instead, he got a quiet statement of fact. That was the kind of response that irritated Briggs the most, a response that showed there was no room for weakness or argument, just duty. As the conversation continued, Briggs pushed harder, trying to provoke Reid further. He accused Reid of hiding behind ceremony and tradition, saying that a soldier's worth was measured in sweat, risk, and battlefield outcomes, not in the pageantry of polished buttons and marching formations. But Reid, ever calm and composed, simply responded, "In my regiment, we salute the dead whether the cameras are watching or not." That hit Briggs like a punch to the gut. He didn't expect Reid to challenge him so directly, and it gave him pause. For the first time, he began to question his assumptions. The next day, Colonel Briggs was back at Wellington Barracks, this time watching a group of guardsmen practice their drill. The soldiers moved in perfect synchronization, their boots clicking against the stone with such precision that it sounded like one giant soldier moving. Briggs stood nearby, arms folded, watching with a critical eye. "You call this training?" he muttered, his voice filled with disdain. "Repetition is how you build robots, not warfighters." Reid, standing nearby, turned his head slightly to face Briggs. "Discipline is training, Colonel," he said quietly. "Repetition is mastery." Briggs was unimpressed, shaking his head as he moved toward the practicing guards. Straight backs, clean turns, polished rifles, good for show. But show doesn't win wars. Reid stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't a combat zone, sir. And that man isn't hesitating out of fear. He's recalibrating to preserve cohesion. That's part of the drill," Briggs scoffed, chuckling dismissively. "That your word for cosmetic unity? It's our word for staying alive, sir," Reid replied, not backing down. Even on parade, Briggs took a step closer, clearly irked by Reid's unwavering stance. "You think I'm here to be impressed by uniforms and choreography?" "No, sir," Reid replied, his voice steady. "I think you're here to understand that not all strength looks the same." Briggs, irritated and frustrated, leaned in closer. "You don't like me much, do you, Sergeant?" Reid didn't hesitate. "I don't have to like you, Colonel. I have to represent this regiment. That's what I'm doing. Briggs sneered but said nothing, his jaw tightening. He had underestimated Reid, but he wasn't ready to admit it yet. He issued a challenge. I want to see you do this parade circuit tomorrow. Let it. Show me what all this tradition looks like up close, and try not to blink when the real soldiers are watching. Reid nodded once, giving the faintest hint of a smile, though it wasn't one of defiance or mockery. It was a quiet resolve. As you wish, sir. The next morning dawned with a chill that bit into the bones. The kind of cold that made your breath hang in the air like smoke signals. By 8 o'clock, the drill square was already buzzing with energy, rows of Coldstream Guards standing in perfect formation, rifles slung, boots clicking in perfect time with one another. Colonel Briggs arrived, sunglasses pushed up on his head, arms folded as he surveyed the soldiers, looking every bit the critic at opening night. He was there to watch, to judge, but Reid was ready for him. The soldiers stood still, the silence between them thick with focus and discipline. Reid emerged from the shadows of the colonnade, no coat despite the cold, his scarlet tunic buttoned to the throat. His white gloves gleamed in the early light. He walked the perimeter of the square with a quiet, unhurried pace, checking on his men as if they were family before a big meal. Briggs leaned over to one of his aides, his voice low. Let's see if he marches like he lectures. A whistle blew, and the parade began. What followed wasn't just training, it was poetry written in steel and scarlet. Every movement, every turn, every halt was a perfect, synchronized display of skill and discipline. The soldiers moved as one, rifles rising and falling in perfect arcs, boots striking the stone in perfect unison. At the center of it all was Reid. He didn't demand attention, he commanded it. His presence was undeniable, not because he yelled or strutted, but because he led with quiet authority, with the kind of calm that made you take notice. Briggs watched in silence, his eyes following every movement. For the first time, he had no words, no criticisms. He simply watched, his mind processing what he was seeing. After 10 minutes of flawless precision, Reid brought the unit to a halt with a sharp command. Company, halt. The entire formation froze mid-step, their boots planting in perfect harmony. Not a single soldier hesitated, not a single sound was heard. Reid pivoted, marching forward to stand before Briggs. He didn't smile, he didn't boast. He simply offered a crisp salute. Briggs, still trying to hold on to his skepticism, tilted his head. Impressive choreography, he said, his voice laced with doubt. But would you hold formation under fire? Reid didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply looked at Briggs with quiet resolve. We already have, sir. Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, every man here has seen deployment. Briggs was taken aback, caught off guard. The soldiers he had dismissed as mere performers had faced real danger, real combat, and they had survived. That realization hit him harder than any battlefield encounter ever could. Reid looked over his shoulder, then back at Briggs. And you think this, he gestured to the soldiers holding formation, prepares them for that? Reid's response was simple, yet profound. No, sir. That prepares them for this. Briggs raised an eyebrow, confused. What's this? Reid's voice softened, his gaze unwavering. Ceremony. Stillness. Standing in front of thousands of people, cameras, dignitaries, all while ignoring the itch in your nose, the cramp in your leg, the scream in your shoulders. That kind of restraint. It doesn't come from ego. It comes from purpose. For the first time, Briggs was silent. He wasn't sure how to respond, and in that silence, he began to understand something he hadn't before. These men weren't just performing. They were honoring something far greater than themselves. Later that day, after the parade, Colonel Briggs sought out Sergeant Reid. They met in the mess hall, where most of the guards were wiping sweat from their brows, tired after hours of standing in formation. Reid was likely expecting a reprieve, but Briggs had other plans. Briggs was waiting by the back wall, coffee cold beside him. "Got a second, Sergeant?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was a subtle tension in his words. Reid didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked over. "Of course, sir." Briggs began pacing slowly, almost like a predator circling its prey. "So, I've been thinking about this culture of yours, the saluting, the silence, the pageantry." He stopped in front of Reid, his eyes narrowing. "I wonder if maybe it's all just a performance." Reid tilted his head slightly, his voice hardening just a fraction. "Respectfully, sir, our discipline is not for spectacle. It's for those we serve." Briggs raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "But who are you serving when you ignore a direct greeting?" "A handshake, let's say, from an allied officer." Reid didn't hesitate. "If it's during a moment of protocol, then no one, because that moment doesn't belong to the living." The entire room fell silent. Briggs' eyes bored into Reid's, searching for any crack in his resolve. But there was nothing, no flinch, no weakness. Reid stood tall, unwavering. Finally, Briggs asked, "And what if I stepped into your line, said your name during a parade? Would you just pretend I wasn't there?" Reid's eyes locked onto his. "Yes, sir. That would be the duty," Briggs sneered. "And if I called you a coward?" The room went deadly silent, everyone waiting for Reid's response. Reid didn't blink. He didn't back down. He simply looked at Briggs and said, "Then I would remember that I'm here to represent the crown, not myself." For a long moment, Briggs said nothing. He was fishing for a crack that would show Reid's vulnerability. But Reid didn't crack. Instead, he suggested calmly, "Would you like to inspect our live fire range, Colonel? We're qualifying tomorrow. You're welcome to attend." Briggs looked caught off guard by the offer. "You lot actually shoot?" Reid gave a faint smile. "We don't just stand still, sir. We aim still, too." Briggs turned to leave, muttering under his breath. But as he reached the door, Reid's voice stopped him cold. "One more thing, sir," Reid said. Briggs turned back, his expression hard. "What?" Reid's eyes were steady, unwavering. "I hope that if the time ever comes, someone will stand still for you, even when you're no longer around to see it." Briggs said nothing in reply. He simply left the room, leaving Reid standing there with a quiet truth that Briggs hadn't yet fully understood. The next morning, rain was coming down hard, not the typical British drizzle, but a proper downpour. The parade ground was a mirror of puddles as the guards prepared for another ceremonial rotation at St. James's Palace. Sergeant Reid was in the armory, inspecting rifles, when he received a message marked "Immediate." He opened it, read the short, terse message, and slipped it into his pocket without a word. The message was brief but clear. Colonel Briggs would be accompanying the procession as an embedded liaison. Reid was instructed to acknowledge Briggs if the colonel addressed him directly. No protest. No questions. Just duty. As the soldiers prepared for the procession, Reid didn't show any sign of irritation or hesitation. He simply moved through his tasks, his focus unwavering. Reid stood tall in formation that morning, his boots clicking against the stone as the Coldstream Guards marched through the gates. Colonel Briggs, in his dark trench coat, walked alongside the unit, trying to keep pace but slightly off. Reid could feel the colonel's eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. The procession was already underway, and Reid had no intention of breaking formation or acknowledging Briggs unless required. As they passed veterans on the northern side of the courtyard, Briggs took the opportunity to test Reid once more. He moved closer, murmuring just loud enough to be heard. "Let's see if protocol's stronger than pride, Sergeant." Reid didn't move, didn't react. His eyes stayed fixed ahead. He didn't look at Briggs, didn't acknowledge him. He simply followed the drill, his movements precise and deliberate. Briggs stepped forward again, this time raising his voice. "I'm speaking to you, soldier." Still, nothing. Reid's jaw remained clenched, his gaze fixed forward as he gave a flawless salute toward the memorial, his movements as perfect as always. Briggs waited. Then, with frustration mounting, he called out one last time. "I'm speaking to you, Sergeant." The challenge was clear, but Reid didn't break form. He didn't respond. He didn't look at Briggs. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, the salute never faltering. And when they reached the end of the procession, Reid's gaze remained steadfast. Briggs, for the first time, was faced with an unwavering discipline that he couldn't break, no matter how hard he tried. Reid had held his ground without speaking a single word. Colonel Briggs, frustrated and somewhat unsettled, lingered by the gates after the ceremony, still processing the unexpected discipline he had witnessed in Sergeant Reid. The Coldstream Guards were a regiment he had long dismissed as nothing more than ceremonial figures, performing for show and not truly understanding what it meant to be a soldier. Yet, Reid had proven him wrong in the most quiet and defiant way. The silence during the procession had been louder than any words could ever be. It had been a statement, not of rebellion, but of purpose. Reid's refusal to acknowledge Briggs during the ceremony had been more than just a refusal to bend to Briggs' rank, it had been a refusal to allow anyone or anything to undermine the sacred tradition of their duty. Briggs had expected a breakdown, a moment of frustration or confrontation, something to confirm his belief that these soldiers were nothing more than walking, rigid symbols. Instead, he had witnessed discipline, cohesion, and restraint that not only spoke to their strength as soldiers but also to their deep respect for the tradition they represented. Reid didn't act out of defiance but out of a sense of honor and duty. Reid's stoic demeanor, his complete disregard for the colonel's jabs, had now left Briggs questioning his own understanding of strength. Was it true that the greatest soldiers fought only in combat zones? Or could the greatest strength also reside in moments of complete stillness, in silence, in the midst of public scrutiny, and in the face of provocation? Briggs didn't know. But as he made his way back to the barracks, his mind kept replaying the images of Reid, his unwavering posture, his quiet authority. The colonel had been a man of action, but in that moment, he had witnessed the power of restraint. Later, when Briggs sat in the mess hall with his aides, sipping a cold cup of coffee, his thoughts kept drifting back to Reid. There was no way around it, the sergeant had gotten under his skin. The more he thought about it, the more the ceremonial guards began to seem less like a theatrical performance and more like a necessary symbol. Reid had said it himself, they weren't just performing for the cameras. Their silence was a sign of respect. Respect for the fallen, for the families watching, for the nation, and for the men standing beside them. Briggs realized, perhaps for the first time, that his own combat-hardened view of soldiering didn't encompass the full spectrum of what it meant to be a soldier. Strength came in many forms, and sometimes, the greatest strength wasn't in action, but in the ability to hold one's ground, to remain silent when all others might shout or break. As the evening wore on, Briggs' aides noticed that he had been unusually quiet, a far cry from his usual chatter. He seemed lost in thought, his gaze distant, his mind far from the conversations at hand. Something had shifted inside him, but he couldn't put it into words just yet. All he knew was that Sergeant Reid had shown him something far deeper than mere discipline. It was honor, a concept that had long seemed distant to Briggs, who had always equated honor with the heat of battle, not with the stillness of a ceremonial march. The days that followed were filled with more drills, more encounters, and the slow burn of tension between Colonel Briggs and Sergeant Reid. The colonel couldn't help but feel the weight of Reid's unwavering composure, and he knew that there was still one more test left, an encounter where Reid's resolve would truly be put to the test, and Briggs could finally see if he had truly learned something from the soldiers under his scrutiny. It came on the final day, when the ceremonial guards were preparing for yet another procession. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the bite of winter, sending a chill through the soldiers' bones. Colonel Briggs, once again in attendance, stood at the edge of the parade ground. This time, however, there was no criticism in his voice, no questioning looks. He was simply there, observing, Sergeant Reid stood in front of the ranks, his white gloves gleaming, the scarlet tunic fitted perfectly to his frame. The soldiers around him were poised, prepared for the day's procession. There was no sign of hesitation, no trace of nervousness in Reid's demeanor. He stood before them, calm, composed, a symbol of everything that the guards represented. As Reid looked out over the men under his command, he could feel the weight of the legacy that he carried with him. Every move, every step, every turn in the formation represented something greater than just a military tradition. It represented the sacrifices of countless soldiers who had gone before him, men and women who had fought in wars and died for the very ideals that these soldiers were charged with upholding. Colonel Briggs, standing on the sidelines, watched Reid as the sergeant moved the company into position. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic flourish. Reid simply moved with purpose, his actions flowing like a dance, one that had been practiced and perfected over years. The soldiers followed his lead without question, their movements as synchronized as a well-oiled machine, and Briggs, for the first time, understood. He had been wrong all along. The strength of these soldiers was not in their ability to fight in the heat of battle but in their ability to stand firm in the face of public scrutiny, to carry the weight of history on their shoulders and remain unbroken. They were soldiers not just in the field, but in their hearts. They were disciplined, yes, but more than that, they were guardians of something far more sacred than the colonel had initially realized. As Reid led the guards through the procession, Briggs saw the quiet power in the soldiers' movements, their unity, their strength, and their unwavering commitment to their duty. There was no flash, no ego, no desire for recognition. It was a display of pure, unyielding discipline, and it was the kind of strength that only comes from a deep understanding of one's purpose. For a moment, Briggs stood still, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of praise or criticism. He simply watched, absorbing the lesson before him. There would be no applause, no acknowledgement of what he had learned. But in his heart, he knew that the men of the Coldstream Guards, and Sergeant Reid in particular, had shown him a kind of strength that transcended anything he had ever experienced in his combat career. It wasn't until several days later, after Colonel Briggs had returned to his home base, that the full weight of the experience truly hit him. He had spent weeks in the presence of men who didn't seek accolades or recognition. Soldiers who weren't driven by pride or the need for validation. What they had shown him was something far greater, a quiet strength, an unspoken resolve, and a commitment to something larger than themselves. The lesson wasn't just about the value of tradition, it was about the value of discipline, honor, and duty. It was about understanding that true strength didn't always roar or demand attention. Sometimes, the strongest people in the room were the ones who stood quietly, unmoved by the distractions around them. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone because they already knew who they were and what they stood for. For Colonel Briggs, this was a revelation. He had spent so much of his life equating strength with physical prowess, with the loudest voices and the most dramatic actions. But now, he understood that the greatest strength was in holding firm, in standing silent when all the world might be screaming at you to act. It was in doing the right thing because it was right, not because anyone was watching. The next time Briggs encountered a soldier, he would remember Reid's steady gaze, his unwavering resolve, and the quiet power of his presence. He had learned that sometimes, the strongest soldiers were the ones who never needed to raise their voices. And as for Sergeant Reid, he would never know the impact he had on Colonel Briggs. The lesson he had taught was one that Briggs would carry with him for the rest of his life, even if it was never spoken aloud. In the end, the tradition that Briggs had once dismissed as meaningless had shown him the most profound lesson of all, the strength to stand firm, to hold one's ground, and to represent something far greater than any single individual. It wasn't just a performance. It was a living testament to the courage, honor, and dedication that define true soldiers. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.